The snow had been falling on the Ardennes Plateau for 11 hours when Corporal James Waverley of the 601st Quartermaster Truck Company climbed down from his cab and felt the cold enter his boots through the cracked sole he had been meaning to repair since October. It was the morning of the 17th of December, 1944. The temperature was 8 degrees Fahrenheit. His convoy of 22 trucks had stopped on a logging road 3 kilometers east of Malmedy because the lead vehicle had slid into a drainage ditch and the men were standing in the open, in the grey pre-dawn, trying to attach a tow cable to the front axle with fingers that no longer worked properly. Waverley remembered, later, that he had been thinking about coffee, not about the German counter-offensive that had punched through the American lines the day before, not about the SS armoured columns that were at that moment moving through the same forest in which he was standing. He was thinking about the tin cup of coffee that was sitting, almost certainly cold by now, on the seat of his truck, and whether it would be worth walking back to retrieve it. He never drank it. What happened in the next 4 minutes on that road, and what happened to the German officer responsible, 6 weeks later, in a sequence of events that the army classified and did not discuss publicly for nearly 3 decades, is a story about two things that the United States military preferred, in 1944 and for many years afterward, to keep in separate rooms. The first was what American soldiers in black service units actually experienced in the European theatre. The second was what George Patton was willing to do when he believed that a wrong had been committed against men under his command, regardless of what the regulations said, regardless of what the diplomats preferred, and regardless of whether those men were the kind of soldiers the army officially considered worth defending. Those two things were about to collide. Part 1. The Army within the Army. The United States Army that mobilized after Pearl Harbor was, by law and by custom, a segregated institution. This was not a wartime emergency measure. It was a feature, not a bug, a deliberate structural arrangement that had survived every major American conflict since the Civil War and had been formally codified in Army Regulation 2-1010, which prohibited the assignment of black and white soldiers to the same units. Understand what this meant in practice. It meant that when the War Department needed truck drivers, cooks, stevedores, engineers, and ammunition handlers, the unglamorous, essential, back-breaking labor that keeps a fighting army alive, they assigned those roles disproportionately to black soldiers. Not because black soldiers were less capable, because the army's logic held that black soldiers should not be placed in combat positions alongside white soldiers, and since they had to be placed somewhere, they were placed in the service and supply branches. In 1943, approximately 78% of black army personnel in the European theatre were assigned to service units. 78%. The Red Ball Express, the supply corridor that fed Patton's 3rd Army and Bradley's 12th Army Group during the breakout from Normandy, was run overwhelmingly by black drivers. At its peak in September of 1944, the Express operated more than 5,500 trucks, running 24 hours a day on a one-way loop stretching from Saint-Lô to supply depots near the German border. The drivers slept in their cabs, they ate from ration tins, they drove with their headlights off at night to avoid German aircraft, on roads that were barely roads, at speeds that exceeded every safety regulation the Army had ever written. The 601st Quartermaster Truck Company was one of the Red Ball units. Formed at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, a base located in a state where black soldiers were routinely harassed, refused service at local establishments, and in several documented cases, physically assaulted by white civilians and even white military police, the unit had crossed the English Channel in the summer of 1944 and had been running supplies ever since. Their commander, Captain John T. McBride, white, from Georgia, a career logistics officer, later described his men in a report to 3rd Army Headquarters as the most reliable drivers in my experience of 4 years of Army service. He meant it as a compliment. It was also a testimony to how good these men had to be just to survive the institutional contempt aimed at them from their own side. Here is the detail that matters for everything that follows. When the Germans launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, on the 16th of December 1944, The front lines that buckled and broke were in the American First Army sector. Patton's Third Army was to the south, facing the Saar region. The supply routes that fed the entire Allied northern sector ran directly through the Ardennes, which meant that the black truck drivers of the quartermaster units were suddenly not behind the front. They were in the middle of it. The roads they had been running supplies on for months were now roads that German armoured columns were trying to seize. And some of those drivers were captured. Part 2. The SS and the Snow. The unit responsible for what happened to Thomas Foster and his companions was the 1st SS Panzer Division, known as the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. This was the premier formation of the Waffen-SS, the division that had been Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment before the war and had grown into a full armoured division of roughly 22,000 men by late 1944. Its commander for the Ardennes operation was SS Brigadeführer Wilhelm Mohnke, 43 years old, a veteran of campaigns in France, the Balkans, the Eastern Front, and Normandy. But the immediate actor in the incident we are investigating was not Mohnke. It was an SS Hauptsturmführer, the equivalent of an army captain, whose name appears in the subsequent military investigation as Hauptsturmführer Karl Leugers. The records on Leugers are incomplete. What survives comes primarily from the testimony of 2 survivors of the incident and from a Third Army Judge Advocate General investigation conducted in the spring of 1945. Leugers commanded a reconnaissance element of the Leibstandarte, a unit that had pushed ahead of the main column on a secondary road south of Malmedy in the opening days of the offensive. On the 17th of December 1944, the day after the offensive began, the same day that the Malmedy massacre was taking place roughly 8 kilometers to the north, Leugers' unit intercepted a small convoy of American supply trucks attempting to withdraw westward. The convoy consisted of 4 2.5-ton trucks, commonly called deuce-and-a-halves, carrying fuel and rations. The drivers and their escorts, 12 men in total, all from the 601st Quartermaster Truck Company, were taken prisoner after brief resistance. Hold that number, 12 men. What happened over the next approximately 40 minutes is reconstructed from 2 sources. The testimony of Private First Class James Holloway, 23, from Birmingham, Alabama, who survived by being partially buried under the body of another soldier, and the testimony of Corporal Elias Tate, 24, from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who was wounded but crawled into the tree line and was found by American forces 3 days later, suffering from a gunshot wound to the left shoulder and severe frostbite on both feet. According to both men, the 12 prisoners were marched at gunpoint to a drainage ditch approximately 30 meters from the road. They were ordered to lie face down in the snow. Leugers, identified by both survivors as the officer giving orders, described as approximately 30 years old, medium height, with the distinctive SS collar insignia, addressed the men through a German soldier who spoke some English. The translated instruction was to remain still and they would not be harmed. They remained still. The order to fire was given. 10 of the 12 men were killed. Holloway survived because the soldier who fell on top of him, Private Raymond Sims, 21, from Jackson, Mississippi, absorbed the burst from an MG-42 that would otherwise have killed them both. Sims died. Holloway lay still in the snow for 4 hours until the German column moved on. Tate, hit in the first volley, had fallen at the edge of the ditch and managed to roll into the undergrowth while the Germans administered what the investigation would later call finishing shots to the men who were still moving. 10 men, shot in the snow. Unarmed prisoners. The investigation would later establish with reasonable confidence that the killings took place between approximately 9:15 and 9:50 in the morning on the 17th of December. The temperature at that hour, according to weather records from the nearest Allied meteorological station, was -12 Celsius. Think about what Holloway did next. He lay motionless under Raymond Sims for 4 hours. He did not know if Sims was dead. He could feel the blood. He could hear German voices. He could feel the cold eating through his clothing into his skin. He stayed still for 4 hours. When Holloway finally moved, he was so cold he could not stand for several minutes. He crawled to the nearest farmhouse, where a Belgian civilian family hid him in their cellar for 2 days before American forces re-established control of the area. He was evacuated to a field hospital on the 19th of December. He was the one who told the story first. His after-action statement, taken by a First Army intelligence officer named Lieutenant Colonel David Feinstein, ran to 11 pages of testimony. It was marked secret and forwarded up the chain of command. It reached 3rd Army headquarters on the 22nd of December, 1944, the same day that Patton was finalizing the plan for the relief of Bastogne. George Patton had 2 things on his desk that morning. He would deal with both of them. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what the Ardennes actually looked like, for the men nobody put in the history books, not the version that survived in press releases and monument inscriptions, but the version that Holloway and Tate wrote with their bodies in the snow, hit the like button. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer, and that matters. Part 3. What Patton did. George Smith Patton Jr. was 59 years old in December of 1944. He had been commanding 3rd Army since August, when it was activated for the breakout from Normandy. In the 4 months since, his army had advanced further and faster than any American force in history to that point, liberated more territory, taken more prisoners, consumed more fuel, moved more men. He was, by the cold arithmetic of operational results, the most effective army commander the United States had fielded in the war. He was also a man of violently contradictory impulses on the subject of race. Understand this clearly before we go further. Patton was a product of his class, his era, and the American South's particular mythology about itself. He used racial language that is not reproducible in a serious investigation without triggering the kind of reductive argument that obscures the actual history. He held views about black soldiers that ranged from paternalistic to contemptuous, depending on the day and the context. And yet, his actual record with black units under his command was more complicated than his reputation suggests. He had commanded the Buffalo Soldiers, the all-black 10th Cavalry, during the punitive expedition into Mexico in 1916. He had later written, in a letter to his wife Beatrice, that the 10th Cavalry's troopers were fine soldiers who had been ruined by bad white officers. That sentence contains both the racism and the respect simultaneously. That is the man we are dealing with. When the Holloway report reached Patton's headquarters on the 22nd of December, his reaction was documented by his aide-de-camp, Major Charles Codman, in a diary entry that has since been declassified and is held at the Patton Papers collection at the Library of Congress. Codman wrote that Patton read the report twice, said nothing for approximately 30 seconds, and then said, "Find out who did this, find out the unit, find out the officer, and find out where they are now." That was the instruction. What followed was a formal investigation order, 3rd Army JAG Investigation No. 44-1217, initiated on the 23rd of December, 1944. The officer assigned to lead it was Colonel Homer Sherwood, 3rd Army's Judge Advocate General, a lawyer from Columbus, Ohio, who had been in the Army since 1935 and had spent the previous 18 months prosecuting American soldiers for crimes ranging from theft to murder. Sherwood's investigation had 3 immediate problems. First, the crime scene was still in German hands. The drainage ditch where the killings occurred was behind German lines until the 28th of December, when American forces re-established control of the road. Sherwood's investigators could not reach it for 11 days after the murders. Second, only 2 witnesses survived, and one of them, Tate, was still in a field hospital recovering from his shoulder wound and frostbite. His testimony was taken at his bedside on the 26th of December by one of Sherwood's officers. Third, the perpetrator, Lugers, was somewhere inside the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, a division of 22,000 men currently engaged in the largest German offensive of the entire Western campaign. He was not available for questioning. Sherwood proceeded anyway. By the end of December, his team had confirmed the crime scene, the bodies of 9 of the 10 dead soldiers were recovered when the area was retaken, identified the unit responsible through a combination of prisoner interrogations and captured German documents that placed Luge's reconnaissance element on that specific road on the morning of the 17th, and collected physical evidence, including spent cartridge casings consistent with MG42 and MP40 fire. The 10th body was never recovered. It is believed to belong to Private Raymond Sims. One detail that Sherwood's investigation established has been almost entirely absent from every subsequent account. The killings were not a spontaneous act of combat violence. The prisoners had been disarmed, marched to a specific location, and executed in a deliberate, organized manner. Luge had given the order. His men had obeyed. This was not a moment of battlefield confusion or panic. This was a war crime. Premeditated and carried out with the procedural calm of men who had done similar things before, because they had. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler had a documented history of prisoner killings stretching back to 1940 on the Western Front in France, to the Eastern Front, to Normandy. The Malmedy massacre, where 84 American prisoners of war were shot by another element of the same division on the same day, was the most famous example. The killing of Thomas Foster and his 11 companions was not an aberration within this unit. It was a pattern. Patton received Sherwood's preliminary report on the 29th of December. He read it. He signed two things. The first was an order that Sherwood's investigation be elevated to a formal war crimes case and forwarded to the Theatre Judge Advocate General at Chaif, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, in Paris. This put the case into the machinery of the Allied war crimes prosecution system that would eventually become the Nuremberg and Dachau trials. The second was a personnel order. Patton transferred the surviving members of the 601st Quartermaster Truck Company, those who had not been killed or captured in the December fighting, out of the supply role and into a newly formed Provisional Combat Unit attached to the 4th Armoured Division. This was not standard procedure. Quartermaster troops were not combat troops. Moving them into a combat attachment required explicit command authority and explicit justification. The justification Patton gave in the order itself was 3 words: "They have earned it." Stop and think about that. In an army that officially held that black soldiers were not suited for combat roles, an army that had spent years arguing at the highest institutional levels that black men lacked the temperament, the intelligence, or the courage for frontline service, the commanding general of 3rd Army had just written in an official order that a group of black soldiers had earned the right to fight. That order was not a press release. It was not a speech. It was a military document filed in the 3rd Army records that carried the full weight of Patton's command authority. Part 4. The verdict and what came after. The forensic verdict of this investigation was unambiguous. What George Patton did in response to the killing of 10 black soldiers in a frozen ditch in the Ardennes was not a single dramatic act. It was a sequence of deliberate institutional decisions, each one more consequential than the last, that unfolded over the final months of the war and into the post-war period. The war crimes investigation that Patton initiated on the 23rd of December 1944 eventually fared in. The tribunal found him guilty in July of 1946 and sentenced him to life imprisonment. He served 9 years. In 1955, under a series of commutation decisions made by the American High Commissioner for Germany, decisions driven partly by Cold War political pressure to rehabilitate West Germany as an ally, and partly by a sustained lobbying effort by former SS officers and their legal representatives, Luge was released. He returned to West Germany. He died in 1981 in Cologne at the age of 67. Hold that sentence. 9 years for 10 murders. The contrast with what happened to the black soldiers he killed is worth stating plainly. Private Raymond Sims, 21 years old, from Jackson, Mississippi, who died in a drainage ditch in Belgium on the 17th of December 1944, his body was never recovered. There is no grave. His name is on the wall of the missing at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium, among more than 450 names inscribed there. Private Thomas Foster, the man we met at the beginning of this story, was among the 10 killed. He had survived the Red Ball Express, the ambushes, the cold, the institutional contempt of an army that put him in a truck instead of a tank because of the colour of his skin. He died at 26, face down in the snow, executed by an officer of the SS. He did not live to see what Patton did next. But what Patton did next matters, and it matters precisely because it was not enough, and because Patton knew it was not enough. The provisional combat units that Patton attached to the 4th Armoured Division, the men of the 601st Quartermaster Truck Company who had not been killed or captured, served in combat through the final advance into Germany in the spring of 1945. The 4th Armoured was the division that broke through to Bastogne on the 26th of December 1944, one of the most celebrated relief operations of the entire European campaign. The men Patton attached to it were there for the push into Germany itself. Their service was documented. Their combat records were filed. Their names were recorded in the 4th Armoured's after-action reports. And then, after the war, they came home to an America that was still legally segregated. The GI Bill, which transformed the lives of millions of white veterans, funding education, home loans, business loans, was administered through local institutions, which in the South and in much of the North meant it was administered in ways that systematically excluded black veterans. The men who had survived the Ardennes, who had been told by Patton himself that they had earned the right to fight, came home to the same country they had left. What demands attention in Patton's order is the weight of 3 words: they have earned it. It was not a policy change. It was not a desegregation order. It was one general's decision for one unit in one moment under the pressure of a specific atrocity. It did not change the army. The army did not desegregate until President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, 3 years after the war ended, 2 years after Patton himself had died in a car accident in Heidelberg, Germany, on the 21st of December 1945 at the age of 60. But consider what the order was. In a system built on the premise that black soldiers were worth less as fighters, worth less as men, one of the most powerful commanders in the American Army wrote, in an official document, that these specific men had earned something. He wrote it because 10 of their companions had been murdered. He wrote it as an act of institutional acknowledgement that the army owed them something it had not been paying. Was it enough? No. Was it what he could do, in that moment, with the authority he had? Yes. Those 2 things can be true simultaneously. The history does not require us to choose. James Holloway, Private First Class, 23 years old, from Birmingham, Alabama. The man who lay under Raymond Sims for 4 hours in -12-degree cold was discharged from the army in September of 1945. He returned to Birmingham. He worked for 31 years at a steel mill. He gave one interview in 1989 to a researcher at the University of Alabama documenting the experience of black soldiers in the European theatre. In that interview, he was asked what he remembered most about the day in the ditch. He said, "I remember thinking that Raymond was trying to keep me warm." He meant Sims, the man who had fallen on top of him, the man who was already dead. Elias Tate, corporal, 24 years old, from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, lost 2 toes to frostbite from the days he spent in the tree line before being found. He was medically discharged in March of 1945. He became a schoolteacher. He taught history at a high school in Tuscaloosa for 27 years. He died in 1993 at the age of 73. He never testified publicly about what happened in the ditch. His testimony exists only in the Sherwood investigation file, classified until 1978, and in the Dachau trial records. He taught history for 27 years. He knew something about what gets remembered and what doesn't. And now, the most important detail of this entire investigation. The Sherwood Report, the 47-page file that documented the killing of Thomas Foster and his companions, that named Lugers, that provided the physical and testimonial evidence that eventually put him in front of a military tribunal, was classified secret when it was filed in December of 1944. It remained classified for 34 years. It was declassified in 1978 as part of a systematic review of World War II records. For 34 years, the official record of what happened to those 12 men in the snow was locked in an archive. The men themselves knew, Holloway knew, Tate knew, the families of the dead knew, in the fragmented, incomplete way that families of the missing always know, that something happened, that the body never came home, that the letter said "killed in action" without explaining how. But the file that could have told the full story, that names the killer, that documented the crime, that placed it in the context of a pattern of SS atrocities, sat in a vault. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and more troubling, the institutional instinct to manage difficult information. The army in 1944 and 1945 was not eager to publicize the murder of black soldiers by German forces, partly because publicizing it would raise questions about why those soldiers had been on that road in the first place, why they were in supply roles instead of combat roles, why the army's racial structure had put them in a position of particular vulnerability. The story of the killing connects directly to the story of the segregated army. You cannot tell one without implicating the other. Patton's order, "They have earned it," was also never publicized. It did not appear in the press. It did not appear in the official histories of the 3rd Army or the 4th Armored Division. It appeared in the personnel records of the 601st Quartermaster Truck Company, where it sat unnoticed until a military historian named Dr. Adrienne Harrison found it in the National Archives in 2007 while researching the logistics of the Ardennes campaign. Harrison published her findings in a 2009 article in the Journal of Military History. It generated modest academic attention and virtually no public attention. This is the story that almost nobody tells, not because the records are missing, because nobody looked. Return for a moment to December of 1944. To a frozen road in the Ardennes, to Thomas Foster, 26 years old, from Meridian, Mississippi, lying face down in the snow. He had driven through German artillery. He had driven through ambushes. He had run supplies across northern Europe so that an army could advance, so that other men could fight, so that the war could be won. He had done this in an army that told him, by law and by custom, that he was worth less than the men whose supplies he was carrying. Tate did not survive to see what Patton wrote, nor did he live to see Lugers convicted or released 9 years later. He was gone before the army desegregated, before the Civil Rights Act, before any of the things that came after. What he survived long enough to do was drive the truck, run the route, do the job, and when the Germans came, he was captured and he was killed, not in battle, but in a ditch, on his knees, by a man who saw the color of his skin and decided that the rules of war did not apply. Patton read the report. He initiated the prosecution. He wrote the order. 3 words: "They have earned it." It was not enough. It was what he had. The men who were killed in that ditch had earned far more than 3 words in an order that nobody read for 60 years. They had earned the country they were defending. They never received it. That is not a moral lesson. That is a fact. And the facts in this case are heavier than any conclusion I could offer you. If this investigation gave you something you didn't have before, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, and remember, the history that matters most is usually the history that nobody classified as important enough to tell. Thomas Foster, Raymond Sims, 10 Men in the Snow. Remember the number, remember the name.